Welcome to the Rideshare Guy Podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
Andrew Macdonald is the Senior Vice President for Uber's operations globally. He's currently leading Uber's cross-functional task force in response to the coronavirus pandemic, helping to ensure the safety of drivers, delivery people, and the communities we serve. Prior to this role, he served as the Vice President for Uber's Americas operations and global business development. Originally, he's from Toronto, so he's Canadian. I think that's a good thing. Andrew's passionate about developing the entrepreneurship ecosystem. He sits on the board for Rise Asset Development, which provides microfinancing and mentorship to entrepreneurs living with mental health and addiction challenges, and he advises a number of other local startups. And I know he's a very busy guy right now, so I appreciate you coming on. Andrew, how are you doing?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me, Harry.
Yeah, I'm doing well. And, I know we first started chatting really, at the beginning of this pandemic. And I don't know, it seems like a long time ago for me. I'm curious if, it seems like this has been a long process for you, or has it gone by really quickly?
It's one of those where some weeks feel like decades, and then I look back and I'm like, wow, we're this is sort of the new normal, and it feels like an eternity pre-COVID, but it does fly by in a sense, just because we're so busy with everything going on, as I know is the case for many folks.
Gotcha. Yeah, and I think a good place to start is the cross-functional task force. And I don't know if that's the official name for it or unofficial name, but it sounds like you've been leading those efforts. And can you kind of just explain at a high level what that is and maybe how it came about too? Sure.
So like many companies, I think this is the first time we've ever dealt with something like this. And what I will say is, we're global, so we're in 65 countries around the world. And so we had a preview to what was going to hit the whole world, really, a little bit early. We started seeing the impact of COVID in our North Asia business in sort of late January and February. And at that time, we got together somewhat of I would call it a more regionalized, localized team that was adapting to the business. We closed our Hong Kong office. We made some changes to the service, but it wasn't yet a company-wide priority. And at the same time, it wasn't yet a worldwide issue. In late February, the woman who runs our North Asia business, Susan Anderson, sort of rang the alarm bells a little bit internally and said, look, this is coming, and
got it.
It's going to require an entire company response. And so Dara called our entire leadership team together, essentially said, we need to spin up a task force on this. Mac, I'd like you to lead that. We made the decision to cancel. We were supposed to get 150 of our most senior leaders in the company together in San Francisco that first week of March, just like an annual leadership summit type thing. We made the decision on the spot to cancel that meeting, not just because we didn't want everybody traveling and getting a couple hundred people together, but also we wanted people in their markets focusing on COVID response, because things were heating up rapidly. And so we canceled that meeting. Instead, I got about 45 leaders together, and we planned our response over 2 days. And from there, it was basically felt like 24/7, rapid decision making, adjusting to new realities, making decisions both for our own employees and how the company would operate through it, but also for drivers and couriers on the platform, for consumers who use the platform, how we'd interact with governments. I mean, you know how it is. There's literally hundreds of decisions we made over the following weeks, and it's tough, but I think we've done a decent job navigating our way through it.
Yeah. And I think that's one thing that's interesting that sort of I'm always reminded when I interview or speak with folks at Uber is that, I think a lot of people tend to focus on the US operations and the US numbers, but a lot of the product managers, a lot of the people like yourself are typically working, on one product, but globally. Is that sort of sound about right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think our global footprint is one of the things that makes us unique as a company. We're also very local in terms of how we approach
Yeah.
running the business. We're not there's many tech companies that are global, but almost everything is run out of San Francisco. We have
Gotcha.
people on the ground in the markets we operate in running the business. We have physical footprint. We've got our green light centers for drivers. So we tend to be a lot more local than most tech companies. And I think that's the nature of the business, right? It's an operations business. It's, we're physically exist in the real world and deal with all the challenges that come with that. So yeah, we are much more global, much more spread out. And that has pros and cons, honestly. It makes things more complex, but it also keeps us closer to our consumers.
Yeah. And I'm curious to learn more about the sort of difference in response, because you mentioned, you as a company, you not only have, as a tech company, you not only have to think about the employees at a corporate level in San Francisco or, even on the operations teams in your local markets, but you have this whole cohort of drivers. And I guess I would even take it one step further and say riders too, that, I guess riders maybe aren't as high on the totem pole as the corporate employees, and you're not going to be thinking about them as closely or carefully, but you have these different constituents that matter. And I guess I feel like from a corporate level, kind of asking employees to stay home seems, I wouldn't say simple, but seems on the simpler side versus, drivers and, should they keep driving? Should we make all these changes? So how did that initial, sort of thinking go when it comes to corporate employees? Because I know you guys instituted early for them to start staying at home. And how'd you think about that difference between, let's say, corporate employees and drivers, basically?
Yeah. This was an area that we spent a lot of time on, as you might expect, because there was definitely some tensions that we were trying to wrestle with. Right. We are a Silicon Valley based tech company, and many companies in the Valley that we have typically are competing with for talent or are viewed as peers. They went really, really early to work from home for everybody, and we had a lot of folks internally that thought that was the right answer. We initially moved to sort of optional work from home, i.e., employees, if you don't feel comfortable coming to work or you have vulnerable family members, you can choose to stay home. And very quickly, I think within a matter of days, we pivoted and said, okay, recommend work from home, which essentially is mandatory work from home. Because everybody did it at that point. And one of the tensions we were wrestling with is, how do we go out to our employees and say, hey, we want you to stay home while running our service, while having couriers on the road delivering food, while having drivers providing rides. And ultimately where we landed was, obviously some roles are better suited for work from home than others. And, many jobs, it's just not possible to work from home. Right. And two, we view the service that couriers and drivers have been providing through the crisis as really essential service for cities. Right. Yeah. And we went out to our riders and said, don't ride unless you have to. You probably saw some of our messaging on that, in-app rider messaging saying, stay home if this isn't an essential trip. But the reality is, for a lot of people, they had to be out in cities. They had to be going to work. And so, or they were ordering food. And so, that was how we navigated that tension. But there was a lot of debate on it internally. And I would tell you, we adapted our decision a number of times.
Yeah, because I'll be honest, I think when I first, like you mentioned, Uber and tech companies in general in the Bay Area, I think were very early to have their employees start working from home. And I think when I saw that, I thought to myself, wow, all these drivers are out here still driving, but Uber is telling their employees to work from home. It seems like a bit of a mismatch. And, I think as the crisis progressed, it seemed like definitely, one of the positives I think that has come out of this is that, I'm hearing from a lot of drivers, the rides that are happening are those essential rides. Of course, people might still be joyriding here and there, but I think I did respect Uber for, encouraging riders to stay at home or at least only ride if they needed to, because I've heard from a number of drivers, that have been taking nurses to the hospital or taking people on, grocery runs that, can't get those, services elsewhere. So I think that's definitely been one of the positives aspects of that for sure.
Yeah, I think drivers and couriers are some of the most unsung heroes in this crisis, right? I mean, they've kept those people that need to be going, whether it's a nurse or a grocery worker or whatever. So they've kind of kept the people that need to keep moving moving, or they've allowed people to stay home and still have access to the things they need. So totally. And I think we we hear from a lot of drivers that they're really proud of the service they've been able to provide. And I think I agree. It's a silver lining.
Yeah. And so I think definitely early on, there was a lot of confusion and chaos. I mean, I think we saw stories about, drivers and riders who were discriminating and, kind of like I was talking to drivers who were avoiding the airport, which kind of, seemed a little bit, not the right thing to do at the time, but kind of looking back, it almost seems like, if the virus was spreading from other countries, you probably wanted to avoid airport trips. So I'm curious, kind of how you think Uber did in that initial response. Because I know for me, okay, if drivers do have to be on the road, like how much responsibility did you feel that, for Uber as a company, that if drivers are going to be driving and couriers are going to be delivering, how much responsibility do you feel that, every driver should, let's say, have PPE? And obviously, that wasn't the case, and you can talk about the challenges about, getting PPE, but I'm curious to know, like, how much responsibility you think Uber as a company should have had, especially in those early days, and then we can talk about, kind of what you guys are doing now.
For sure. So in the early days of the crisis, we identified a number of sort of pillars to our response that were going to be front and center. One of them was platform safety, and of course, this is both rider and driver safety, or courier and eater safety. And as you'll recall, Harry, the understanding of the crisis evolved a lot over what now seems like an eternity, but at the time, literally the advice from virus experts and health authorities was changing daily. And in the first couple of weeks where we were formulating our response, the official guidance from most public health authorities was that masks don't make an impact. That and in fact, some were saying they actually make it worse because they cause people to touch their face a lot and they give them a false sense of safety. And so, while we were very committed to platform safety early on, as we thought about PPE and what was possible, well, masks was off the table according to our experts and according to most conventional thinking at the time. So obviously that guidance has evolved.
Turns out that was sort of a mistake, huh?
100%. And, one of our principles very early on was to trust the experts. And I think the upside of that was that we avoided, as a company that doesn't have expertise in that space, making decisions about, areas that were beyond us. The downside was that the experts were learning at the same time that we were. And so we were literally, doing daily or sometimes twice daily calls with our consulting epidemiologist who was advising us on, hey, we have this situation, if a courier drops off a bag, what's the risk to the customer from the bag? If a driver's in the car with a passenger, should they sit in the front seat? Well, no, that would be better not. Should they have the windows open? Yes, it would be better. And literally wrestling with those types of cases every day to figure out what our response should be. As we got conviction to move on PPE, we started scaling up orders of disinfectant wipes and sprays and masks. And at that time, we just started running into the supply chain challenges that I think every company has. And, while I think we're in a much better spot now in terms of what we distributed and what's going out over the next few weeks, certainly it took us longer than we would have liked to get things out the door early on.
Yeah. And I know that, you guys did stop doing shared rides, and, recently you announced that there's basically no more front seat riding. Was there ever a thought in your mind that maybe we need to stop service completely?
So we did discuss that. I mean, we pretty much discussed every potential permutation of what we could do. What we developed very early on was essentially a framework for categorizing markets around the world. And as a city went from, say, essentially green, which is business operations as normal, not a lot of cases, all the way to sort of extreme impact, we had a series of actions across our business that we would gradually take. So as a city moved from category 1 to category 2, we would shut down shared rides. As a city moved from category 1 to category 3, we would stop all customer communications, the normal things you do, incentives or advertising, these types of things. So, we tried to link the actions we were taking to the status of COVID-19 in a city. Now, what quickly happened is, almost all our major markets over a matter of weeks went all the way to the most extreme category.
Right.
And as it relates to shutting down the platform, the decision we made early on was we would take our lead from governments. So essentially, if governments asked us to shut down, we would, which is what happened in India. India essentially went to the most extreme response. And so we shut down our business except for, literally a few hundred trips a week under a view called Uber Medics, where we're working with the government to transport healthcare workers in specially equipped cars and those types of things. But for the most part, what we heard from governments around the world was, we want you to keep operating. People need to move around. People don't necessarily feel comfortable going on public transit. And so we were able to keep operating in most places, but obviously at extremely depressed volumes. And we saw, the people that were using the service were healthcare workers, people working in essential services, these types of businesses, and governments saw that too. And that's why I think they enabled us to keep operating.
Got it. Yeah, no, I appreciate you sharing that background. So I'm curious to know, on the driver side, what's the sort of biggest change to the product that you've had to make kind of in response to the pandemic?
Well, I think that the decision to shut down shared rides was probably the earliest big decision from a product perspective that we made. And this was something that we heard from drivers very early on in the crisis that, hey, you know what? I'm okay doing a trip with one individual in the car. What I'm not comfortable with is 4 people packed into my car. And so we made that decision, and essentially within a matter of 3 or 4 days of the initial pool shutdown, we shut down pool all over the world. So that was a pretty big change. And honestly, that was a change that we didn't take lightly on the rider side, because as you might expect, the most price sensitive riders are the ones who choose pool. It's the cheapest option. Okay. And believe it or not, pool actually declined slower than all our other products. So as the crisis started to hit, you started to see trips really drop off. Shared rides dropped the slowest. And I think part of that is the unfortunate reality that a lot of the people who weren't able to actually work from home were a bit more cost conscious. And so we're choosing pool. And so we actually wrestled with the decision on the rider side, because we said, look, people are choosing this option because they need an option that's safe. They're probably choosing it because they don't want to get on a crowded bus right now. And so we did feel a little bit of tension there, but ultimately made the decision to shut it down. That was probably the biggest one. And then I think since then, the moves you've seen us make on the safety side of things, such as, mandating masks, for example, that's a pretty fundamental change. And I think 4 weeks ago, when we first started discussing it, seemed like a pretty crazy idea to some people, because masks are not widely accepted in every market, certainly not even in the US, in every state, and it's turning into a bit of a political issue and all this other stuff. So we wrestled with some of those, but those are probably the biggest ones.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's interesting for sure. And I think from the driver's perspective, I know that drivers are, not always the biggest fan of pool rides, and especially during, the times of COVID, because you're sort of potentially, exposing yourself to more people. So it's interesting to hear that converse side. And I think it makes a lot of sense too, that perspective. I've done many pool rides myself and can kind of, confirm that. It does seem like, I guess for me, sometimes I feel like, I wouldn't say that I had a crystal ball, but I feel like a lot during this pandemic, I was hearing from a lot of drivers about things like, hey, I'm not doing airport trips anymore, or, hey, I don't want to do shared rides anymore. And then 1, 2, or 3 weeks later, I would see Uber come out with the policy. And obviously, I'm kind of hearing anecdotes here and there, so I wouldn't expect Uber to be able to shift on a dime. But I am curious about that feedback loop between Uber and its drivers, because they really are the ones on the front lines. And, I think that example of the fact that, maybe there were some potential discrimination issues at the beginning, and now kind of looking back, like, in some ways, right, like, for example, like not doing the airport trips might have been a smart move on some drivers' behalf, right? So I'm curious how that feedback loop worked between Uber and drivers, and how it could get better too in the future. Yeah,
so I would say we are always looking to the feedback we're getting from drivers, from all our customers, but from drivers in particular, for how we should evolve the platform, what product changes we should make. And, there are sometimes tensions we have to work out between what a rider would like and what a driver would like. Obviously, if we let's say we made the decision early on to just turn off the service at airports, I think we would definitely face a lot of criticism from people who are still traveling or people who have no choice to travel. So again, it's always about trying to
balance the two sides.
And perhaps there's ways you can align economic interests better, right? Maybe we don't turn off airport trips, but you pay extra for them or something like that. So the drivers who choose to do that are being rewarded. So we try to get creative in figuring out solutions that balance both sides.
I guess I'm curious to know, like, for example, in this situation, like how specifically, were you getting feedback from drivers? Because I imagine, most drivers, like they're venting to me and, I imagine if they go to customer service, right, like that's really the main, and kind of like, I know that from time to time, Uber is doing focus groups on new products or services and getting feedback that way. But when you sort of need quick feedback from, a group of constituents that you don't normally get quick feedback from, right? Like their point of contact is really kind of like customer service. And I can't imagine, customer service is, the best at relaying like the issues drivers are facing, on a daily basis with like regards to PPE and, who they should pick up or who they shouldn't pick up and all of those issues to kind of inform.
You'd be surprised.
Or is that the best channel?
Yeah, you'd be surprised because we essentially do daily reporting of customer support, feedback by category or issue type, right? And then those insights are surfaced very actively by our community operations team, which is our customer support team. Okay. And they're surfaced to the product team, to the ops team, and then we adjust on the fly. So I'll give you an example. With the policy we've just rolled out, we are tracking two things. One is how often do we hear that somebody had a mask on and they did the selfie and it actually was a false, it gave a false reading. So if we're getting a lot of support tickets from drivers saying, look, I had a face covering on and it didn't work, that's a good way for us to know, hey, actually something's broken here, we need to fix it. And then we try to rev on that really quickly. Or how often are we seeing disagreements between riders and drivers because, one is wearing a mask and one is not. And, at peak, you might get thousands of those a day. For us at our scale. And then we would take that information, again, surfaced by our team, and within, try to turn around evolution to the product, changes to the policies, or even just communication. Sometimes it's just about educating riders or drivers about what the policy is. So customer support's actually a really great channel. Another area, and you and I exchanged some messages on this, but our first version of the financial assistance policy for drivers, while I think well-intentioned, definitely had a lot of bugs in its implementation, and drivers were finding it, onerous to go through the process, found the documentation requirements somewhat onerous. And so we launched a V2 of that, and much of that was based on the feedback we were hearing from drivers about the original process. And I think it's been better, frankly, in the V2. And that's always our goal, is to try to turn around changes really quickly based on the feedback we're getting.
Yeah. And I think that's important for people to remember, I guess, like you said, right, that when you're operating and doing millions of rides a day, probably even during the pandemic, I imagine the numbers are probably still up there. It's hard to look at one by one data points. You almost have to look at these 1,000, data points, for example, to find or uncover an issue. But I'm curious if there's any, two questions, if there's any sort of, what I call, like, there's the data side, but there's also, like the human or the driver side, right? Like, I feel like a lot of these issues, maybe, for example, like, someone like myself or, drivers who are experienced or a group of drivers, like, I don't think a lot of times you always need a bunch of data to be like, hey, this isn't going to work too well. Or, for example, with like the face coverings, what happens if it doesn't read my face correctly and I need to log on that day to make money and, I have a bill due at the end of the day because I use instant pay and I'm going to cash out that money at the end of the day and now I can't log on to work. Like, if I contact customer support, are they going to be able to instantly, do a video chat with me and get me back on the platform? Because I think like the stuff like that, you might uncover it through the data in 1, 2, or 3 days, but for that driver who needed it in that first hour, they're going to be kind of out of luck, I guess, or the guinea pig in a sense, right?
You're totally right. And we don't always get it right. And unfortunately, at our scale too, you will hear lots of those stories you just described, where a driver needs access to the platform for one reason or another, is blocked, doesn't get the customer service resolution that they want right away. And in those cases, we try to make it right. We try to go back and review the situation and if compensation is necessary or anything like that. But it is hard. But you're right. We do take anecdotal feedback. I get emails from drivers all the time. I read them, and often I see in the email, I'm like, yeah, that's not wrong. That's not right. Something's broken. And I send it to the right team member, and I say, like, what's being described here is an issue, and we need to fix it. And so it doesn't take 1,000 of those tickets. It takes one read by somebody with a critical eye to get it fixed. But it obviously shouldn't take emailing me to get something fixed, but
and I think that's kind of how we first started chatting about some of the financial assistance programs for drivers and the sick pay, because there were drivers that sort of, to me, kind of clearly met the guidelines, but couldn't quite get it resolved with customer service. And I know, after many tries or sort of, once they found the right person, they were. And I guess talking about the sick pay program, I guess the evolution, you mentioned a V1 and a V2. I think there's been a few versions of that even since then, right? And I mean, I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but the gist of the evolution of the program, it's now sort of covering more people or more situations, but paying out less per driver. Is that right?
Yeah, I think I think that summary statement is correct. To give you some sense, we've had, I think, close to 50,000 people who've received financial assistance through the program globally, and we've distributed about 19 million globally. So, that's where the numbers, $19 million. Okay. And that's again a global figure. The goal of, you're right, that we brought in the program to try to ensure that more individuals would qualify. I think one of the goals there is, as you say, sometimes people who are impacted by COVID need faster access to income to be able to feed their families. And so we wanted to make the process lower friction to capture more drivers in it. But when you do that, obviously there's a trade-off with how much you're paying out. So we made that change, and I think it's working better, frankly, right now.
Well, sorry, I know we're running low on time, so I'll sort of ask maybe one more question. But I think I think when the sick pay, I was almost even surprised that Uber came out with this sick pay, because it's not something that, in a sense, they were required or had to do. I think it seemed like the right thing to do. So in that way, it was good. It's good to know that drivers received $19 million, 50,000 drivers. But I'm curious to ask you sort of how much responsibility in general do you think Uber has for financial assistance, whether it's sick pay? I think on Uber's last quarterly earnings call, they said that they had $9 billion in cash, right? So, 19 million divided by 9 billion is a pretty small number. I'm not saying drivers should get all or even, a large chunk of that, but I think this is like a good question to end on, because it touches some of these other, whether it's government, the PUA, the unemployment programs, right? Right now, the number one question in my inbox from drivers is about, sick pay, financial assistance, but also dealing with unemployment. So I'm curious, how much responsibility do you think Uber has, with sitting there with $9 billion in cash to compensate drivers versus, the government, which, based off, the number of drivers there are, and they're all getting $600 a week right now. I know it's a lot more than $19 million. So curious to know, how much, responsibility you think Uber has in that sense.
Yeah, so I mean, we feel a great deal of responsibility for our drivers and couriers on the platform. It's why I think you saw us launch the various initiatives we did, whether it was sick pay, whether it was other opportunities like the Work Hub to earn on the platform across multiple different efforts. It's why we advocated on behalf of independent workers to governments around the world, and I think. As you saw in the U.S., but also 28 other countries around the world, governments did roll out support for independent workers. The reality is, through this crisis, governments have supported pretty much every sector of the economy, including companies across all types of business, particularly travel businesses. They've supported full-time employees. They've supported independent contractors. And so, we don't think the level of support that independent workers, drivers, couriers have received from the government is out of line with their contributions from a tax perspective, or their contributions, frankly, in society overall. So we're proud to have advocated for that, and we think it was the right thing for governments to do, and we think it was the right thing for us to do. Going forward, we think that independent work does need more protections, and we, as you know, we're advocating for advances in labor law for us to be able to provide benefits and protections for drivers who want to remain independent contractors. I read your survey last week saying that 71% of drivers, even post-COVID, want to remain independent contractors and control their work. So what we're trying to figure out is, how do we make sure that we protect the flexibility of independent work and all of the things that we know drivers love about independent work, while adding protections so that in situations like what we just gone through, they're not as vulnerable. So that's what we're working on. I think we're just about out of time here, but I'm always going to be happy to chat more about that one too.
Cool. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming on, Andrew, and I know you're active on Twitter, so I won't leave your email in the show notes, but I will put your Twitter handle if you're okay with that. And
Sure.
I know we didn't get to chat about all of the resource hubs and the financial assistance and the work hubs, but we'll leave links to that in the show notes below. Really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me, and keep staying safe, Harry.
All right, take care.
Cheers.